June 21st, 2001, somewhere in the red dust of Western Australia, a group of railway engineers are standing beside a set of tracks in the middle of absolutely nowhere, and they are watching something that should not exist roll past them at walking speed. 8 locomotives spread across the length of the train, 682 ore cars loaded to the brim with iron, and a single driver up front controlling the whole thing through a system that has never been tested at this scale before. The engineers have stopwatches in their hands because somebody needs to document exactly how long it takes for this monster to pass a fixed point, and when the last car finally clears their position, they check the time and realize they have been standing there for 12 solid minutes watching train cars go by. 7.3 kilometers of steel and cargo, 99,000 tons of weight, moving as a single unit across the desert floor. The heaviest and longest train the world has ever seen, assembled by BHP Iron Ore to prove that the physics actually work, that you can move this much material with this few people if you get the engineering right. And here is the thing that makes this record so strange. That train ran once, proved its point, and then BHP went right back to running their normal operations because nobody actually needs a train that long on a regular basis. It was a demonstration, a flex, a way of saying, look what we can do if we really want to. The train traveled 275 kilometers from the Newman and Yandi mines to Port Hedland. And it took over 10 hours to complete the journey with a single driver at the controls the entire time. Think about that for a moment. One person sitting in a locomotive cab, responsible for coordinating the movements of 8 separate engines spread across 7 kilometers of track, making sure the braking and acceleration stays synchronized so the couplings do not snap under the strain. The technology that made it possible, the distributed power systems and the radio-controlled locomotives spread throughout the consist, that technology changed everything about how freight moves around the world today. So when people ask what the longest trains in the world are, the answer gets complicated very quickly because there is a massive difference between a one-time record attempt and the trains that actually run every single day hauling cargo from one end of a country to the other. The BHP train holds the official Guinness record, sure, but there are trains running right now in half a dozen countries that would make most people's jaws drop if they ever saw them in person. Trains that stretch for kilometers through deserts and mountains, trains that carry more weight than entire cargo ships, trains that run without drivers, and trains where tourists literally climb on top of the cargo and ride through the night under the stars because there is no other way to get where they are going. The iron ore railways of Australia are where most of these records come from, and that is no accident. The Pilbara region in the northwest corner of the country sits on one of the largest iron ore deposits on the planet, and the only way to get that ore to the coast is by rail. BHP, Rio Tinto, and Fortescue Metals all operate their own private railway networks out there, and they have been pushing the limits of what trains can do for decades because every extra ton of ore they can fit on a train is money in the bank. The BHP record run in 2001 used 8 General Electric AC6000CW locomotives, which were among the most powerful diesel engines ever built at the time, and the whole point was to test whether their new Locotrol system could actually synchronize that many engines spread across that much distance. It worked, obviously, but the real legacy of that test is that distributed power is now standard on heavy-haul railways everywhere. Rio Tinto took things in a completely different direction. Instead of trying to build the longest possible train, they decided to build the smartest one. Their AutoHaul system, which went fully operational in June 2019, runs trains of about 240 wagons stretching 2.5 kilometers without a single person on board. The locomotives are fitted with cameras and sensors. The entire network is monitored from an operations center in Perth, which is over 1,500 kilometers away, and the trains make their own decisions about speed and braking and routing based on real-time data. 220 locomotives running around the clock, hauling 28,000 tons of iron ore per trip, covering 800 kilometers from the mines to the ports at Dampier and Cape Lambert. The company calls it the world's largest robot, and honestly, that is not much of an exaggeration. The first fully autonomous delivery happened in July 2018, when a train carried iron ore from Tom Price to Cape Lambert, while operators in Perth watched through onboard cameras. And since then, the system has logged over 33 million kilometers of autonomous operation, with a reliability rate above 98%. The whole project cost nearly $1 billion to develop, but Rio Tinto calculated that removing drivers from the equation would save them millions in labor costs and eliminate the fatigue-related safety risks that come with having humans operate heavy machinery for hours on end in remote locations. But if you want to see trains that push the limits of human endurance rather than just engineering limits, you need to go to Africa. The Sishen-Saldanha line in South Africa has been setting records since it opened in 1976, and the trains that run on it today are genuinely staggering. 375 wagons, 4 kilometers long, hauling manganese ore from the mines in the Northern Cape to the port at Saldanha Bay on the Atlantic coast. Transnet, the state railway company, broke their own world record in 2019 when they put that configuration into regular service, and the woman who drove the inaugural run was a 33-year-old from a fishing village on the west coast named Elijah Clark. She brought that monster into port after 861 kilometers of track, and the footage of that train snaking through the South African countryside is something else entirely. The Sishen-Saldanha line also holds the record for the longest train ever run before BHP broke it. Back in 1991, South African Transport Services assembled a train they nicknamed the Monster, 660 fully loaded ore trucks pulled by 9 electric locomotives and 7 diesel engines, 7.28 kilometers from front to back, and they ran it the entire length of the line just to see if they could. The engineers who watched it leave the station said it took nearly 7 hours longer than scheduled to depart because of last-minute repairs to the track and couplings, and the whole country was holding its breath until it finally rolled into Saldanha Bay the next afternoon after traveling 861 kilometers without incident. That train generated enough electrical power during its journey to light up a city the size of Port Elizabeth, and the footage of it snaking through the South African landscape became legendary among rail enthusiasts. When you think about the logistics of keeping that many wagons moving in coordination across that distance, with the locomotives spread throughout the consist to distribute the pulling force evenly, you start to appreciate just how much planning went into making it work. South Africa figured out early on that the key to running longer trains is voltage. Most electrified railways run on 25,000 volts, but the Sishen-Saldanha line uses 50,000 volts specifically, so they can pull heavier loads over longer distances without needing as many transformer stations along the route. The engineering that went into that line back in the 1970s was decades ahead of its time, and it is still paying dividends today. Now, if you want to talk about trains that regular people can actually experience, you have to go to Mauritania. The iron ore train that runs from the mines at Zouara to the port at Nouadhibou is not the longest or the heaviest in the world, but it might be the most legendary because of how it operates. 2 or 3 locomotives pulling over 200 wagons loaded with 84 tons of iron ore each, stretching nearly 3 kilometers through the Sahara Desert on a 700-kilometer journey that takes anywhere from 18 to 22 hours depending on conditions. And here is the part that makes it famous. Passengers are allowed to ride on top of the ore. There is technically a passenger car attached to the back of the train, but it is overcrowded and filthy and has no air conditioning, so most locals and adventurous tourists climb up onto the open ore wagons and make the journey exposed to the elements. During the day, temperatures can hit 40 degrees Celsius and the sun beats down on you without mercy. At night, they can drop close to freezing, and you will be shivering under whatever blankets you manage to bring. The iron ore dust gets into everything, your clothes, your hair, your lungs, and by the time you arrive at your destination, you look like you have been rolling around in a coal mine. If you are not careful about where you position yourself on the wagon, you can get blasted by sand for hours on end because the train creates its own windstorm as it moves through the desert. People have fallen off these trains and never been found, their bodies swallowed by the Sahara somewhere along that 700-kilometer stretch of nothing. The railway company officially banned tourists from riding on top of the ore as of 2025, but enforcement is inconsistent at best, and the journey remains one of the most extreme rail experiences on the planet for those willing to take the risk. The Mauritania Railway has been running since 1963, and it is absolutely critical to the country's economy because iron ore exports account for a huge percentage of their GDP. The trains run every single day regardless of weather, and the schedule is essentially whenever the train is full because there is no fixed timetable. You show up at the station, you wait however many hours it takes for the train to arrive, and then you either find a spot on top of the ore or you squeeze into the passenger car with everyone else. The journey crosses a section of Western Sahara, passes through some of the most desolate landscape on Earth, and delivers you to a port city on the Atlantic coast that most people have never heard of. It is not comfortable, it is not safe by any modern standard, and it is absolutely unforgettable. Brazil operates trains that rival anything in Australia for sheer scale. The Carajás Railway, run by mining giant Vale, hauls iron ore from the largest open-pit iron ore mine in the world to the port of Ponta da Madeira on the Atlantic coast. The trains are 3.5 kilometers long, 330 wagons each, carrying over 40,000 tons of ore per trip. The railway itself stretches nearly 900 kilometers through the Amazon region, and it also operates one of the few remaining long-distance passenger services in Brazil, connecting 27 municipalities over a 16-hour journey. The combination of passenger and freight service on the same line creates some interesting scheduling challenges, but Vale has invested heavily in infrastructure upgrades to keep the ore moving because every delay costs them money. The interesting thing about the Carajás operation is how they handle the logistics of loading and unloading trains that long. Each wagon can carry over 100 tons, and they use automated systems to load the entire train in just a few hours. The ore gets dumped into the wagons from overhead conveyors. The train inches forward so the next wagon is in position. And the process repeats until all 330 cars are full. At the port, the unloading process works the same way in reverse, with rotary dumpers that can flip an entire wagon upside down to empty it in seconds. The scale of the operation is genuinely industrial in a way that most people never get to see. China has been pushing the boundaries of heavy haul rail for years, and their Daqing Railway is the busiest single freight line in the world. It runs 653 kilometers from the coal mines around Datong to the port of Qinhuangdao on the Bohai Sea, and it moves over 450 million tons of coal per year. The trains are typically 2.6 kilometers long, 210 wagons carrying 20,000 tons of coal each. And they run at a density of about 65 trains per day in each direction, with a tracking interval of just 12 minutes between them. In 2014, they successfully tested a 30,000-ton train stretching nearly 4 kilometers, using 4 locomotives and 324 wagons, just to prove that the infrastructure could handle it. The Daqing line is electrified at 25,000 volts and uses some of the most powerful electric locomotives ever built, the HXD1 and HXD2 series, with nearly 10,000 kilowatts of output each. The whole system is coordinated through centralized traffic control that manages everything from locomotive power distribution to automatic train inspection, and it represents the cutting edge of what heavy haul rail can achieve in terms of throughput. China has since built an even longer heavy haul line, the Haoji Railway, which stretches over 1,800 kilometers from Inner Mongolia to Jiangxi province. But the Daqing line remains the benchmark for how much cargo you can move on a single piece of track. The United States used to be the world leader in long freight trains, and some of the records set by American railroads in the mid-20th century stood for decades. In 1967, Norfolk and Western ran a coal train with 500 wagons stretching 6.5 kilometers from West Virginia to Ohio, which was the longest train in the world at the time. These days, Union Pacific and BNSF regularly operate intermodal trains over 3 miles long through the American Southwest, carrying double-stacked shipping containers from the ports in California to distribution centers across the country. A typical long train might have 260 well cars carrying over 500 containers, powered by 5 locomotives with distributed power systems that allow them to handle the weight across mountain grades and desert straightaways. Train length has become a controversial issue in the United States because longer trains mean blocked grade crossings that can delay emergency vehicles and frustrate motorists for extended periods. A 3-mile train traveling at 15 miles per hour can block a crossing for nearly 14 minutes, and in rural areas where crossings are spaced far apart, that can create serious problems. The railroads argue that longer trains are more efficient and actually reduce the total number of crossing activations because you are moving the same amount of cargo with fewer trips, but the debate continues in regulatory circles. And then there is the Ghan, which holds a completely different kind of record. It is the longest passenger train in scheduled service anywhere in the world, running between Adelaide and Darwin in Australia on a journey that covers nearly 3,000 kilometers over 2 nights and 3 days. A typical consist includes 2 locomotives and 30 carriages stretching over 700 meters, but during high-demand periods, they extend it to 44 carriages and over a kilometer of train. The Ghan is not about moving cargo as fast as possible. It is about the experience of crossing the Australian outback in comfort, with restaurant cars and lounge cars and sleeping cabins that range from basic to genuinely luxurious. The route passes through Alice Springs and Katherine, with off-train excursions to places like Uluru, and the whole thing is designed for tourists who want to see the red center of Australia without having to drive themselves. The name comes from the Afghan cameleers, who used to transport goods across the same route before the railway existed, and the service has been running in various forms since 1929. The original line was notorious for delays caused by washouts and breakdowns, and passengers sometimes had to help repair the track just to keep moving. The modern Ghan operates on standard gauge track that was completed in 2004, and it is one of the most reliable luxury train services in the world. It is also one of the most expensive, with tickets starting at several $1,000s per person depending on the class of service. What all of these trains have in common, whether they are hauling iron ore through the Australian desert, or coal through the Chinese heartland, or tourists through the outback, is that they represent the absolute limit of what rail transport can achieve. The physics of moving this much weight this far requires constant innovation in locomotive power, track construction, braking systems, and traffic management. Every additional wagon you add to a train creates new challenges in terms of coupler strength and curve negotiation and stopping distance, and the engineers who design these systems are constantly pushing against those constraints. Even the BHP record from 2001 still stands because nobody has had a reason to beat it. The technology exists to build an even longer train if someone wanted to, but there is no practical purpose served by doing so. The trains that actually matter are the ones that run every day, moving the raw materials that the global economy depends on from the places where they are extracted to the places where they are processed and shipped. Iron ore from Australia and Brazil, coal from China and South Africa, manganese from the mines of the Northern Cape. These are not glamorous cargoes, but they are the foundation of industrial civilization, and the trains that carry them are engineering marvels that most people will never see. The next time you see a freight train crossing your path at a grade crossing, blocking traffic for what feels like forever, remember that somewhere in the world there are trains 10 times that length hauling cargoes you cannot imagine across landscapes that would break most vehicles. The longest trains on Earth are not just transportation. They are monuments to what human engineering can accomplish when the scale of the problem demands it. From the autonomous robots rolling through the Australian outback to the ore-laden giants crossing the Sahara with passengers clinging to the top, From the coal trains thundering across China at 12-minute intervals to the luxury carriages of the Ghan serving gourmet meals while crossing the red center of Australia, these trains represent the extremes of what rail transport can achieve. And every year, the records get pushed a little further. The trains get a little longer. And the engineers find new ways to move more cargo with less effort across distances that would have seemed impossible a generation ago.